Howdy. So, as you know, we're unable to meet today due to some travel, so I'm going to walk you through some of the slides we haven't done yet and hopefully get us caught up or keep us caught up. So we've already talked about Chapter 4. We've talked about the different learning outcomes, the tragedy of the commons, what that is, how it relates to environmental protection, free rider problem, how that relates to environmental protection, pollution as an externality and how that relates to environmental protection, and the issues of real cost pricing. And then we started talking about other rationale around why regulation is needed. So all three, very slow. Okay, all three, the tragedy of the commons, the free rider, and the pollution as an externality are arguments made frequently by policy and or economy people around why you need regulation and what's the purpose of regulation. And the other needs for regulation come from other ethics, including environmental ethics, which are influenced by environmentalism, and the different kinds of ideas and worldviews that contribute to the philosophies around environmental ethics. We talked about this in class. We talked about the idea of directly regulating stuff and how that works, and that's frequently referred to as command and control. And then we started to talk about alternative ways to regulate pollution, and those would include nuisance suits, like the work done by Erin Brockovich. And then we started talking about market-based strategies for impacting different pollution. And market-based strategies can be a mechanism for regulation. It's just not command and control. It's employing a different approach in order to get that impact. But if the market-based strategy is somehow employed by the government, it's largely still a regulation of a sort, right? So we discussed subsidies that would be supportive of a greener version of something. Someone brought up solar panels and subsidizing those, and that might help their market grow. Things like emission charges, which put a cost to pollution, and so we get to control the overall cost, but not the amount of pollution in that case. And market emission permits, we control the overall amount of pollution, but not the cost, because the market might drive the cost up based on availability of credits. So that's where we left off. And then the next idea is something that's distinct from emission charges, in as much as it's taxes, and those taxes, they're called green taxes, and those taxes are on polluters themselves, so on industries that result in pollution, and then that revenue from the taxes goes to then pay for environmental programs. So it's distinct from an emission charge, which is, pay per unit that you create, in as much as that it's being it's more of a kitty that all polluters must pay into, and it may or may not be directly per emission. It's just by being a polluter you pay into this, and then those funds are used to create environmental programs or to support other environmental endeavors. So all of this is to contextualize the overall idea of regulating the environment at a federal level, and U.S. environmental policy. And largely, environmental policy is centered around pollution and emission of pollutants. And there are other related areas that have begun to fall under environmental policy, but early on, that was the real focus. And the real reason for that focus is because of the human health effects associated with those pollutants for the most part. So public health is the strongest driver behind the Environmental Protection Agency and around the original policies that were set forth. Very secondary is the actual impact or the degradation on the environment. So we're going to talk about how environmental policy has evolved over time, including the 1970s, which was the environmental decade, the 1980s, which was, the reality is the vast majority of the 1980s was the Reagan administration, the 1990s, which was George H.W. Bush and Clinton administrations, and then the 2000s and the 21st century. So we've got a bunch of things that fall into that. So the 1970s is frequently referred to as the environmental decade because it was the time where several different events and historical features led to the construction of the Environmental Protection Agency and the passage of the first laws associated with it. You'll frequently hear people cite Silent Spring, which was published in 1962 by Rachel Carson, which looked at the overall impact on the ecology of ecosystems where pesticides have been used really heavily, and eventually you have the death of almost all the insects that would be in that ecosystem, and over time that leads to a silent spring because the lack of songbirds, because songbirds need insects to live. And so simultaneous with that, it was a kind of a clarion call for if the insects are all dying and if there's this impact on ecosystems, why do we expect it to be that different for us? Why don't we expect these things to be bad for our own health or that sort of thing? And then in 1968, there was a book called The Population Bomb, and that was written by Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich is still, in my lifetime, has been a real force in ecology. And so that book itself was really looking at, well, what happens if we keep growing the human population? And it really isn't about, a judgment call as to how many children people should have or whether there should be policies around that or anything like that. It was more about, well, if we plan to live our lives in a way where we're hugely impactful on the earth, then perhaps what we should be targeting is reducing the number of us on the earth so that the earth is resilient to our presence and can be, in fact, we can keep the system sustainable. And then in 1969, there was a very large oil spill in Santa Barbara. We've had much larger oil spills since then, but at the time it was a big deal because all of a sudden there was something in the living room of most people that was showing a picture of a really pristine ecosystem. Santa Barbara was well known for really rich people and really beautiful beaches. And here on the nightly news, we saw we saw this oil spill that was hurting the animals and ruining the beach and making it all look horrible. And because there was this new thing called television, to bring that to everybody, the entire country could be disgusted for an event that tends to happen, all mining, all natural resource development, so natural gas, oil, mining, agriculture for that matter, all of those things include accidents and impacts like on a very frequent basis. But the idea that it would show on a large scale in a very pristine place where everybody could see it, that was impactful. In 1970, we had the first Earth Day in response to this. Somewhere in here, there was the Cuyahoga River catching fire. I believe it was 1969 as well. So that was a big event. And on the first Earth Day in 1970, it wasn't what we do now, which is like a picnic and everybody gets together. It was people, it was more like a resistance march. People were marching in the streets. And so sometimes you see it depicted like there's a bunch of kids pushing brooms, and we all decided to clean things up. But really, Earth Day was really people wearing gas masks and carrying big signs and talking about the toxicity of the environment that we're creating for ourselves, and how all the things that are kind of beautiful are going to be gone if we're not careful. And it was millions of people out marching about the environment. And so that was a pretty big deal. And at that time, Congress was responsive to that sort of thing. And so they were trying to figure out what legislation will result in changing some of these patterns they'd been seeing. And so the Congress was kind of getting involved, and they noticed that voters were worked up. And somewhere around that same time, you had the formation of the very first environmental law, which was NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. And we'll be talking a bit about NEPA in this chapter. And the formation, so then Congress was starting to look at how to really regulate the environment to prevent and stop and hold people accountable for pollution in ways that hadn't happened before. And right around that time, Richard Nixon said, well, okay, I better be, if I want to have any influence over this, I better form my own environmental protection agency rather than have it formed under someone who might not form it as conservatively. The EPA, and the EPA started creating the regulations, promulgating the regulations that were responsive to the laws that the legislation was starting to pass. In the 1970s, over 27 different environmental laws were passed. So that's one of the reasons it's called the Environmental Decade. So in 71, there was a book called Closing the Circle by Barry Commoner. Barry Commoner is a guy who kind of, while Ehrlich was really putting a big focus on the impact of high numbers of humans, because humans are likely to impact the environment, Barry Commoner was really putting into focus the idea that our approach to production of everything in our economy and in our consumption was not reliant enough on ecological principles. And if we were to create materials that were less synthetic and more reliant on renewable resources, then we would be living in balance, and we would close that circle. And so we would keep ourselves from overusing resources and overburdening the earth. And so then after the 70s, in a big boom in a lot of environmental laws, and the first years of the EPA, Reagan became president, and as we've talked about in the past, under Reagan, there were declining. When Reagan first came into office, one of the reasons he won was because he was promoting the idea of a deregulated economy, and an economy that knew no bounds, and that it was sunshine in America again. And so he was really this optimistic look at how we can get ourselves out of reasonably tough economic times that had happened under Carter, and also some politically tough times that had happened then as well. So he came in that way, and then his interest was to cut costs and cut regulation in order to spur on this economy that he was talking about. So, and as we know, he appointed Ann Gorsuch, who had very little experience with anything environmental, and was simply put in there to cut the EPA drastically. He reduced staffs and budgets in all of his agency appointments, and the Congress, because Reagan had been reasonably popular and being voted in, the Congress was kind of responsive and supported his ideas as well. But a couple years into these really drastic cuts in an area where there had been so much progress, and a relatively young area, there was a backlash, and there were a lot of popular concerns around the degree to which the progress was being halted and turned back. And so the Congress was kind of called to act and really bring Reagan's people into the to have hearings and to talk to them about, what is it you're doing. And environmental groups were really working very hard at, all the different kinds of cuts and whatnot he was doing. So, and as we talked about before in the in class, somewhere near the end of all of this, Reagan's getting in some trouble in a bunch of different areas. He served 2 terms, as you probably well know, and somewhere in the second term, not only had Ann Gorsuch gotten in trouble for Sewergate, as we discussed before, but there were a variety of different hearings being held all the time near the end of his, middle to the end of his second term. And so there was a lot of fatigue around the government maybe not working around the environment. And so in the 1990s, we saw a shift toward, so George H.W. Bush became president after Reagan, and his inclination was, rather than run into trouble here, how do we incentivize markets so as to and incentivize people producing things to make greener products and to affect the environment in that way. He wasn't super keen on George H.W. Bush wasn't super keen on the environment per se, but he was looking to not be in the same kind of issues and trouble. He was very much a centrist, and he actually inadvertently appointed Riley at the EPA, and Riley was a big advocate for the environment. So he's working in an administration that only cared so much about it, but he was able to kind of stay the course and try and bring back some of the progress that had been made. So then H.W. was in office for from 88 to 92, right? And so so not a ton went on then, but in 92, Clinton and Gore came in and were elected, and we've talked a bit about how that represented to a lot of people a big concern, because Gore had a really kind of a clear agenda with respect to the environment, and they were bringing in relatively activist environmental people who knew a lot about the impacts of industry and that sort of thing. But they were also bringing in a pragmatism that was kind of middle of the road, and Bill Clinton had no interest in having anybody think that he was super liberal, because he was trying to live on that margin of being someone that both Republicans and Democrats could vote for. And so they were kind of careful with respect to it, and they tried to identify ways to keep things clean, keep things safe, without bringing a lot of really strong regulation back against industry. And part of what they wanted to do was identify waste. And so they made a big show of identifying waste. And so that got kind of their industry partners on board with them. And that was how they had a good effect that way. And so that was going along pretty well until somewhere in the middle of that, we had the Congress with Newt Gingrich, who formed the Contract with America, which was kind of a 1990s version of conservatism that had come to Congress in a backlash after Clinton had been elected. It was not unlike the Tea Party coming in after Obama was elected. And that group was interested in, they said they were interested in fiscal conservativeness. And so they were trying to promote less and less government. So around then, from that point forward, the impact that Clinton could have on the government, on the environment ended up being executive order driven, which is not unlike the experience that Obama had after he'd been in office, and then the 2010 group was elected. So in 2000, George W. Bush was voted president, and soon after that, something I should say about Clinton. So a big market effect under the Clinton administration was they were trying to identify ways to have industry participate in voluntary opportunities to increase their environmental, to decrease their environmental impact and to increase the degree to which they manage systems. And they were trying to point out this relationship between, saving costs and preventing pollution in the long, and both of those being good for the business in a long run. And so I have here ISO 14001. One of the ideas around ISO 14001, it's a industry standards, or international standards. So ISO is International Standards Organization, and 14,000 is a standard. 14,001 is the specific kind of permit that one might have. And so the idea is, if you are compliant with ISO 14,000, then you create an environmental management system that says that you're going to adopt the best available management practices for your business everywhere you can. And one effect of that is you pick other companies that are also inclined toward ISO 14001. So while ISO 14001 came into existence in 2004, so that was after Clinton, all the kind of zeitgeist that led to creation of that really was kind of fueled by the efforts under Clinton. In 2000, when W came into office, he had an inclination to move back toward favoring private industry and private rights, and reduction in the size of federal government, and so by definition, more less environmental regulation in general. So we talked a bit about how Christine Todd Whitman was his EPA director, and she had been kind of touted pretty well in New Jersey as a Republican governor who was tackling environmental problems. So she looked like a pretty reasonable pick, kind of down the center kind of pick. But then they created the position with her in it, or put her in the position, but then they simultaneously, and by they I mean W and Dick Cheney, were doing a lot of different things in their administration that wasn't really including the EPA or Christine Todd Whitman or her analysis of what might be best. And so that was pretty well exemplified when she found out about our pulling out of the idea of a Kyoto Protocol from the news rather than directly from the president. So then the Obama administration, it seemed like it was going to be reasonably positive for the environment, but the reality is, under Obama, a lot of what had to be done took place with executive orders, because they were so hamstrung in the legislature that there wasn't a lot that they could do to get amendments made to some of these environmental laws. If you think about the environmental laws, a lot of them have, so if Clean Air Act has one of the more modern set of amendments, and the Clean Air Act amendments are from 1990. So that's many presidents ago, very different technology over time. And so, in theory, there are amendments in a reasonable frequency associated with environmental laws in order to keep up with the technology and the economy and that sort of thing. So now here we are at our first real environmental law. Yay! So the National Environmental Policy Act is, as I stated earlier, a law that predated the EPA, but it was an attempt to directly influence the degree to which environmental impacts were happening among those things that were most easily controllable by the government. And by that, I mean other government agencies or federal impacts on the environment. So things that the federal government was involved in, they could regulate their own, basically. So under NEPA, which is how it's pronounced, there was a prescription for something called the Council on Environmental Quality. This group has 3 members and 1 chair, and the chair is responsible for attending a variety of president council meetings to kind of watch the idea of domestic policy as it evolves, international conferences, and federal agency activities. So the entire Council on Environmental Quality, the entire CEQ, as it's called, is considered a federal watchdog over federal activities that might impact the environment. It uses data, national progress, and legislative recommendations to advise the president on environmental issues. So it's the goal of that group to stay abreast of the current thinking on different environmental issues and to advise the president with respect to it. And they regulate NEPA itself, the NEPA process as we call it, and environmental impact statement or EIS requirements. They also have other oversight functions. So the environmental impact statement aspect of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, is interesting. So it basically requires that any activity that is federal and major and has a significant impact on the environment is regulated under or must have an environmental impact statement. So this in general has proven to be kind of a vague expectation. And so there's been some effort into defining some aspects of this. So again, the idea is that if it's a federal activity involving major resource commitment, that's what major refers to, so it's going to cost a reasonable amount of money, and it's going to have a significant impact on the environment, then there ought to be an environmental impact statement. So CEQ has defined impact by both context and intensity. And so they have this basically like a rubric idea of looking at all the different contexts involved, so local, regional, international, that kind of thing, or short and long term, societal effects, just all those different kind of context points. And then they have an actual scale associated with the intensity. Intensity involves 10 factors that are related to the degree or potential for real effects. So it can be difficult to even know if you need to do an environmental impact statement, is what that really boils down to. So in an environment, if you do an environmental impact statement, it entails 5 required elements listed over here in the green area: positive and negative impacts of the proposed activity, unavoidable adverse impacts assuming implementation of the activity, alternatives to the proposed action, relationships between short-term environmental issues and long-term productivity increases. So is it the case that going through the creation of whatever's happening will have a short-term effect, but over the long term there is a significant uptick in productivity or economic productivity especially. And then taking into account any irreversible resource commitments. So what happens is that people are involved in creating these environmental impact statements, and they cost money, and it costs a lot of expertise, and possibly more importantly, they take time, because which is also money when it comes to the government trying to accomplish things. And so if the environmental impact statement drafting period is expensive or draws on a lot of time, it could actually act as a deterrent to doing the projects, or it could act as a deterrent toward creating projects that will have an impact. So it turns out that so if we go back to what an environmental impact statement is, the way this after the process of creating this environmental impact statement happens, it then goes to the CEQ, which will review the draft, which then goes to, you got it, come on, you could say it, the Federal Register, and for public comment, right? So you have this plan that you're putting together, you have experts involved, the CEQ comments on it, and then that commented plan goes forward to the Federal Register for public comment. A highly criticized draft can force the agency to fix or start over completely, or it could avoid, and part of the idea there is, now you've created this document that says, we plan to go do this thing, and it has this level impact on the environment. And so if there's recognition in your report that you're going to have that impact, you're kind of on the books as saying, hey, we thought about it and we still want to do this. And so that kind of leaves you open for people to take you to court over having done it, or looking at whether or not it was appropriate for you to do it. So then your environmental impact statement is rated by the EPA. And so EPA ratings are used to evaluate the EIS. So there's a variety of different EPA ratings that fall under that. They include a lack of objection, which means that there were no potential impacts to be found to substantially change the proposal. Environmental concerns, which means there are impacts that should be avoided to fully protect the environment. Environmental objective means that there are significant impacts and that must be avoided to adequately protect the environment. And environmentally unsatisfactory, or EU, means that there are adverse impacts that are unsatisfactory for public health. And so those different ratings are a part of how one evaluates a particular environmental impact statement. So this is one thing that can happen, is that an agency wants to do something that's major and federal, but because it's done by the agency, so it's major, it's federal, and it's going to have a significant impact. Another thing an agency could do is say, okay, we want to do a project, but we want to identify a way to avoid it meeting some of those criteria. And the most important criteria for it to avoid is significant impact. So if you could still make the project, it might be costly and it might be federal, but if you can establish that there's no significant impact, then you could effectively not have to do an EIS. Okay, and so FONSI, FONSI, is finding of no significant impact. And so if you do an environmental assessment, which is EA, of your project, which is a much less complex thing than doing an environmental impact statement, but the environmental assessment is kind of looking over what the project might be and identifying a way so that you're not having a significant impact, then you could just simply state a finding of no significant impact, which could keep you from having to do the EIS. And so let me just walk you through this. So the agency has a project, they have a significant impact that's expected, they have to do an EIS. The other way to go is to have minimal or no or unknown impact expected. And so a couple of different ways that might be true. There might be some simple programmatic process that's anticipated, and it's something that happens all the time, and you don't have to do an environmental impact statement on that. And so that's called a categorical exclusion, so a CE. But if you're unsure about the process required for the evaluation of key resources, then you do this environmental assessment idea, and from that environmental assessment you either get a finding of no significant impact, you get an absolute finding of significant impact, which then means you need to do an EIS or an environmental impact statement, or there could be something in the middle where you find that it was going to have a significant impact, but that you identify a way where you could make it not have a significant impact. You realize that there are ways you could go about it, and that's called a mitigated FONSI. So mitigated finding of no significant impact, because of the way you chose to do the study or to do it instead. Okay, so that was EIS. Let me just say before I go that so NEPA is a very large and still kicking process in the federal government, and there's a lot of people who don't like NEPA. There's a lot about NEPA to not like because it's long and drawn out. But having said that, NEPA is the model that a lot of countries have adopted. So it's found all over the world now, and in that way, it's been kind of influential in general on basically how governments choose to determine and put on record the impacts that they're having on the environment. So NEPA was the first act that I wanted to kind of take you through. And one of the reasons that this chapter handles NEPA, and then this, which was the 1970s, the first real environmental law that had the biggest, that's still impactful today. How's that? And in the form that it is. NEPA is it's a federal act, right? It's it's all about how the federal government does stuff. So is the Pollution Prevention Act of 1990. And so that's why they kind of both get lumped in here. So this act was looking at the move away from a focus on waste treatment and disposal toward pollution prevention, as in the title implicates, right? And so the idea was, if you could get the federal government to look to avoid those practices that would be pollutive in the first place and adopt practices that were less polluting, then you would actually get source reduction, which would mean you'd have source reduction and also recycling of goods within a process. You might, create markets and do a lot of things that would, in the long run, mean that you don't need to dispose of or clean up or monitor the pollution in the first place. So source reduction and recycling thought of as more cost effective. And the Pollution Prevention Act of 1990 encourages this type of regulation with grants. So basically, it's not exactly subsidies, because the person has to write a proposal. That's what a grant is, and they apply for the funds in order to be allowed to implement what they see fit as to reduce the production of pollutants and that sort of thing. And then over time, you see people adopting more and more of those approaches because they do see the benefit of never creating the waste in the first place, or never creating the pollution in the first place. So the Pollution Prevention Act was supplemented by executive orders and other forms of pollution prevention. But it really was the first act to kind of have everybody look at, well, how do you go about things? And is there a way to just look at the entire process and stop before you even create pollution? So there are 6 steps outlined by the EPA for setting up a pollution prevention program. This is a summary of the original fact sheet by EPA. Demonstrate management support for pollution prevention as an organizational goal. Itemize and systemize waste generation and management costs. Conduct and pollution prevention assessment so that waste prevention is continually sought. Allocate true costs to waste management to the responsible generating activities through a cost allocation system. So that entity within your process that is creating the pollution should really be able to see the true cost associated with that pollution. In other words, that if you're going to create that pollution, then there ought to be a mechanism within that part of your entity where you have to pay the cost associated with recycling it, and that might then lead to different sorts of decision making around, is it really too costly to prevent pollution in the first place? And number 5, support transfer of different technologies. And 6, review the program for feedback and improvement. So that list right there really represents the early version of an environmental management system. And so the Pollution Prevention Act kind of looked to, or really was a precursor to things like ISO 14000 and just this idea of managing things so that you're doing the best approaches to begin with, and so then maybe you might prevent the impacts in the first place. And then finally, green initiatives. So green initiatives are policies and regulations meant to encourage the federal government to sustainably purchase things or develop business practices. And so the EPA has made efforts within its own structure to this end. EPA strategies involve facilities and operations, and environmental management system, and a green initiative for electronics. So the idea is to encourage government actions that are sustainable. And like I said, the EPA is built on green initiatives, facilities and operations. They have environmental management systems, and they use green initiatives for technology. So if you had a green initiative around technology, you would both consider what you were purchasing, and based on how sustainable it is, how long it's going to last, but also how those companies deal with their waste, or whether they take the waste back, or identifying the best possible purchase in order to minimize your impact. Thanks.